Welcome to the Politics Guys, the place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Good morning.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing?
I'd like to say I'm tan, rested, and ready after a couple weeks off, but I'm neither tan nor rested, but I suppose I'm ready.
But you are ready. Yeah,
Yes.
It is nice to be back after a short break. And by the way, about that, folks, before we get started with the show, as you know, if you're a regular listener, the last 2 weeks, Trey has been hosting the show with two of our potentially new first non-guy politics guys co-hosts, the first Athena King and then Alexandra Philandra. And we need to get your feedback now. We have our thoughts on it, but of course, we do the show for you, and we want to know what you think about both Athena and Alexandra, and also about, the rest of us as well. So I put together a really short, simple survey that takes, I think, 2 or 3 minutes at most to fill out. And that's if you're being kind of verbose about your comments, and you don't have to put in comments. But if you could let us know what you think, that would be incredibly helpful. And I will put a link to the survey in the show notes. And so we would really appreciate your feedback on that. Thanks so much.
It's like American Idol, or The Voice. It's like you get to choose America's next podcast superstar.
Yeah, it really is. In fact, I was going to start off by saying it's time to choose, but I thought that would be a little hokey, so I didn't do it. One other thing before I get started, also, I was actually interviewed on a podcast called Staley's Well, which is a podcast about philosophy, politics, current affairs, literature, and film based in the UK. And the host of the podcast, Patrick O'Connor, actually is a listener to this show. And he contacted me a while back and said, would you like to come on and talk about, yourself and political philosophy and all that? And I said, well, you're sure. Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. And we had a great conversation about sort of my intellectual origins. I talked a lot about Edmund Burke, because I talk about Edmund Burke whenever I can. Yeah, I thought you'd like that. John McCain, the possibility of socialism in America. I am not rating it as high. And, of course, Donald Trump and the upcoming elections. A lot of stuff. It was a great time. I really enjoyed it. So I would encourage you to check it out. Again, the show is Staley's Well, and I'll have a link to the show as well in the show notes. All right. So, I thought we'd start off with the story that's really been dominating the news this week, and that's, of course, the alleged murder of, well, now it's not alleged anymore, of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia's Istanbul consulate. Now, the Turkish government has been conducting an investigation, and they claim to have audio of Khashoggi's torture and murder, though they haven't released it or, to our knowledge, even shared it with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when he was in Turkey this week. Now, U.S. intelligence officials seem nearly certain that he was murdered with the full knowledge of the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, who's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, as he's sometimes called.
It's the cool
yeah, MBS, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But, and earlier this week, there was this talk that the Saudis would release a statement saying that, yes, there was a role and he's dead, and it was the result of rogue operators. And in fact, that's exactly what happened yesterday when the Saudi government announced that Khashoggi died after essentially a fist fight at the consulate, and big brawl, and that 18 Saudis had been arrested for further investigation, and that the deputy director of their intelligence agency had been dismissed. Now, President Trump, who has been, a lot of people would say, has been slow to condemn the Saudis for this, did say that, well, he found this explanation credible, but then he added, Saudi Arabia has been a great ally, but what's happened is unacceptable. And also, I should mention, there's been a lot of talk about, well, why is the president been so slow to condemn? And some people have suggested, well, it's about protecting a key U.S. ally. And there definitely, in the Trump administration, has been this move toward Saudi Arabia to sort of counterbalance the move away from Iran. And they're the two major powers in the area. But also, there are some people suggest, when the Trump organization was in big trouble in the 90s, the Saudis in some ways really helped to kind of bail them out, or at least be helpful. And since Donald Trump has been president, they have spent very lavishly at Trump properties. And some people are suggesting a connection there. And then on the right, I should mention, there's been, some sort of, I guess you'll call it an anti-Khashoggi campaign. There's some people saying, well, he's been kind of tied to terrorist groups. I mean, Donald Trump
Well,
Jr.
not kind of tied. I mean, he's very much allied with the was very much allied with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right, the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, well,
which again I might say is not officially a terrorist group, but is linked to terrorist
right.
groups.
So, but I mean, you have things like, Donald Trump Jr., who tweeted that Khashoggi was tooling around Afghanistan, as he put it, with Osama bin Laden in the 1980s. And he didn't really, mention at all that, well, this was in the context of writing a story, and it wasn't like he was a follower of bin Laden's in any way. So obviously there's a lot going on here. Jay, what do you make of all this? I'm particularly interested in how you would evaluate President Trump's handling of this situation, which has obviously come under a lot of fire from the left.
Well, I think the fire against Trump on this is sort of weird with the typical criticism from the left of foreign policy of the right is this, what they say, lack of nuance. You know what I mean? Everything's black and white. You're good guys or bad guys. You're with us or against us. And I think in this case, Trump has been. I think it's appropriate to act the way he has, in that he's shown sufficient. There's a sufficient gravity to this. For example, I mean, sending Pompeo. Steve Mnuchin then recently withdrew from an appearance he was going to be making in Saudi Arabia also. And given this, okay, let's get the facts. And see what happens. I think they knew the facts, or at least the basic fact, that he was killed by the Saudis, or someone operating, if not at the express behest of the Crown Prince, then someone certainly allied with them and allied with the Saudi government. But I think it's this is a little bit of diplomacy. Do you condemn them right out of the gate and say this is horrible before you get all the facts, or sort of let it play out and let them sort of come back with a mea culpa? Yeah, we shouldn't have done this. This is terrible. We regret it, and then extract a price from them. And sort of welcoming them back into our good graces eventually. I guess you see where I'm going there. So I think this sort of the knee jerk of I'm not sure exactly what Trump, should we bomb Saudi Arabia or sanction them immediately?
No, I understand.
Not, but I think sanctions are something we can talk about down, as we make sure we have all the facts. So
I think, to me, the difficulty is separating Donald Trump rhetorically from Donald Trump substantively on this issue. And that's always something of a struggle for me, because thinking about some of it, it's more, to me, what I have trouble with is how he said what he said. But I certainly agree. I mean, the idea of, well, we shouldn't jump to conclusions about this until we have the facts. I mean, how it's hard to argue with.
I wouldn't even say. I think it's fine to jump to conclusions because I think we know the basic conclusion.
Yeah.
But I think it plays better. And it when you're dealing with an ally, and they are an ally. That instead of jumping out and condemning them, we do this, what we've apparently done, diplomatic outreach, and sort of cajole them into coming forward and admitting that this is a big problem. They really screwed up, and now they will have to do something, whether that's something publicly or privately, to indicate just how sorry they are about that, and in order to make sure they understand that any more of this type of behavior could cost them severely.
Yeah, but I guess, to me, I don't know that they're necessarily getting this message, and so this to me is part of sometimes it feels like part of a larger sense that Donald Trump has a great deal of sympathy for autocratic rulers, and he said obviously a lot of things that are very anti-press. And I mean, it's hard. You can't divorce that from the larger context. When in a rally, I think just last week, he says, well, anyone who, can body slam a reporter, I'm paraphrasing. That's my kind of guy. And that's the sort of thing. I think he's never, no, that's not fair. I think he's never really appreciated how powerful his words are and how they need to be tempered. I think he totally appreciates that, and he just doesn't care. And that to me is hugely problematic. But on another sense, it occurs to me that that we talk about MBS, and a lot of people have felt like, well, here's this young reformer type guy, and he's going to take Saudi Arabia in a new direction. And that, in fact, is the big bet that the Trump administration has made. And they turned, it was his first foreign visit after he became president. And so pretty clearly they're saying, we're going to move away from this theocratic regime in Iran, and we're going to put a lot more of our eggs in the basket of Saudi Arabia, our ally. And, to me, it seems like there's a lack of appreciation for history here. I mean, this whole thing about people being taken in by the promise of reformers in autocratic regimes. You got, Chavez, Mugabe, Gaddafi, Castro. I mean, we can go back as far as you want. And it seems like that you get burned every single time because it's not about the individual. It's about the system that they're in. And I think whenever you put too much of your faith in any one person in that sort of regime, you're going to end up regretting it.
Well, I think though we need to take a look at a clear-eyed, rationalist sort of look at what we're dealing with in the Middle East, and the choice there has always been between bad and worse, as far as who we're going to support. Now there are some places, for example, Jordan, which is sort of a liberal monarchy, if you will. That seems pretty, and Egypt, which again by Middle Eastern standards one would consider moderate liberal. By our standards, we would consider it a military dictatorship. It's a different world over there, and I think we have to be cognizant of our ability to change those. The culture of those places and the difficulties in trying. I mean, if you look at the big, George W. Bush experiment, was this belief of if you planted a seed of democratic government in the Middle East, people would take to it and they would say, man, this is the best thing ever, and it would spread. And we tried that in Iraq. I would say the experiment isn't the results aren't completely in, and may not be completely in for 50 or 100 years, but it's at least shown that it's not just an automatic of okay, now people are voting. Right. Now that they've got the vote, they're going to have as we understand it, liberal Western style democracy with minority rights and due process and restrained power in the government and all that sort of thing. So again, I look at it as
I think you're right about there not being a lot of great options in the region. And of course, part of the tragedy is at one point, and not in the not too distant past, Turkey was that's the largest economy in the region, and it was a relatively free democratic regime. But since Erdogan took over in around 2014, that's changed. So our options have just gotten worse, essentially. But I understand your sort of realpolitik argument. But I also think here's where there's that old saying, hypocrisy is a tribute vice pays to virtue, right? And
I say that a lot. Yeah.
And I think there's really something to that. While you acknowledge that we have to do these things in the real world, but just simply abandoning any pretense of caring about the values that matter to us, I think that's a really bad thing to do, and that's one of the things that I feel that the Trump administration has done. And so when people say, well, the Obama administration, when you look at the substance, did kind of the same thing, say yes, but they didn't just essentially just say, well, human rights don't matter. And so in some sense, Saudi Arabia has been a good ally, but to call them a great ally and to embrace the Saudis, I think is a big mistake because they are responsible for so much awful stuff. Their ties to 9/11, their
Sure.
ties to Islamic extremist terrorism, and of course their involvement in this horrific civil war in Yemen, which, by the way, we are supporting logistically. That to me, I think there's some real problems here.
No, absolutely, and I think what you got at earlier is the Trump, the person who just sort of spouts off versus Trump, the policy. I think the former is again, he says, "Oh, they're great out," because he just says stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Great is sort of his go-to adjective for whatever. Perhaps at least he didn't say they're a very great ally. But so I mean, I think looking at the policy of what did the U.S. actually do? What have we actually done in terms of dispatching a Secretary of State there immediately, working with the Turks, withdrawing the visit of a cabinet official, and saying that there are going to be consequences. I think those are all the proper steps to take. So,
what do you make of the fact that Turkey, says they have this audio evidence, but yet they apparently didn't play it for Mike Pompeo, and they haven't released it in any way? I mean, does that seem what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's just sort of something that I mean, look, I don't know. It's there's no way that I would we would have. So this is pure speculation. My sense is that is something that was kind of put together for domestic release in Turkey and other places to show how bad the Saudis are, it's to play to their home base and others around the Middle East, as opposed to actually having actual audio.
So you don't think
I don't think
it's
I don't
bluff?
think they do.
Okay.
I think it's a bluff. And here's the other thing. There's the bizarre sort of thing of like, okay, if you actually have audio that you're bugging all the inside of like a foreign consulate, wow, do you
that's an
admit
issue.
that?
Yeah, that's
because again, if the Saudis, I hear that, the first thing is like, hey, we should really check this place. Which again, you'd assume that the Saudis check the place daily, right? I mean, that's how this these things work. And so,
wasn't there? That reminds me. Wasn't there? I seem to recall that a U.S. embassy. This is back in the Cold War days. In Russia, we'd built a new embassy or a new building, and it was so riddled with bugs that the Russians had put it in that we essentially had to just abandon the building or something that. Know? But yeah, that raises a concern. In terms of
coolest thing ever to do. Just because I have sort of a I love spy stuff, but yeah, we're the we installed. I think it was we did it or the Russians did to us. Like, especially installed a bug in their copy machine that sort of just like copied everything.
Oh, wow, that's neat. A copier, yeah.
If I found it eventually.
But, let's talk a little bit about consequences, because the administration has said from the beginning that if this is demonstrated, there will be consequences. Now, there are a couple ways this go. They could accept the rogue operators kind of things they're reforming, but it seems that, like I said in the intro, that the intelligence community finds this extraordinarily hard to believe. And if Donald Trump accepts the conclusions of his intelligence community over the Saudis, which is an open question given the fact that he's not necessarily inclined to do that all the time. Now, what we can do to punish Saudi Arabia, it seems to me that there are three basic options here. We can, first off, sanction the specific officials that we believe are responsible, and those are financial system sanctions, essentially.
That's an easy one, actually.
Yeah, and there's a lot of authority for the president to do that right away, and without that's pretty simple and straightforward and very targeted. Then there's also the potential of halting or delaying U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, they're the single largest buyer of U.S. arms. That's kind of a broader thing. And then thirdly, or maybe along the lines with that, we could withdraw some of our logistical support for Saudi operations in that civil war in Yemen. So I think those are the three main options. What do you think in terms of what seems most appropriate?
Well, I heard someone on TV, and I forget who exactly, But they made the good point of how this probably plays out. And this is often sort of how diplomacy works is the Saudis will come up with some sort of lie / cover story. We'll know it's a lie. They know it's a lie. Most of the international community knows it's a lie. And you're sort of seeing that with there was this brawl because, brawls just happen at consulates. It's like, you walk in the consulate, get in a bar fight kind of thing.
Khashoggi came in with ready to fight. I mean, it's ridiculous, of course.
And we will publicly accept that and say, okay, make sure it doesn't happen again. And there will be some public consequence. And I think the sanctioning those involved, again, that's sort of an easy to do. You know what I mean? You're not necessarily harming the relationship. You're still extracting some sort of a public price. There might be some room for the administration to walk back support for the Saudi operations in Yemen, which is maybe something they want to do anyway, right?
Yeah.
So there's that, and then I think there's also going to be sort of their private discussion, because I do think the Saudis realized that this was a big screw up. And so again, this was someone else made the comment, and then again I forget who because it's just been that kind of a week. That look, when other autocrats have people assassinated, be it Putin. Or others, they don't do it in their own embassy, their own consulates.
Right.
You at least have sort of plausible deniability. But the Saudis apparently did not. This was just kind of a botched operation all the way around.
Yeah, I buy that it was a botched operation, certainly, because they wouldn't have wanted to be discovered in the first place. But I don't buy that.
But I guess just the idea, though, how do you not be discovered, right? I mean, he walks,
goes in and doesn't come out.
Consul and doesn't come out. Yeah.
So it was really just a bad decision from the top down, essentially. But more than, and again, so people say, well, you guys always focus on the strategic, kind of the politics part of it, but there's an ethical morality type of issue here. And it's reprehensible to kill any innocent person, and especially to kill somebody who's a political opponent. I mean, this is the kind of thing that is just completely repugnant to our values. And I would argue that in addition to just sanctioning specific Saudi officials, which fine, that's something, we need to make that a strong statement of how important those values are to us by saying, hey, we are willing to take big steps that say how important this is. And if you think that we have nowhere else to go but you and that these values don't matter to us, well, we're going to hold up some arms sales. We're going to reconsider some of this stuff. And then maybe if you feel there's a threat of your regime being slightly destabilized, that maybe that will cause you to think again. Because honestly, I don't think that some individual sanctions in and of themselves are going to have much of an effect.
And again, I don't think they would either. I think what has more effect is that behind the scenes conversation.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think I doubt that, and I doubt that because just of the nature of the regime. And I think unless there's persuasion or looking deep into his eyes, as was it George W. Bush with Putin had said, finding the inner humanity or something. No, these autocrats. I mean, the maintenance of their power is the main thing and the only really lever that you have to push on. And that's the only way I think we're going to get any sort of real response is if we say, hey, we can make that a little more iffy. And then they'll say, well, maybe we should not be killing American journalists or any journalists, certainly, because obviously there was a calculation made here that this was to the benefit of the administration because Khashoggi was a threat to the stability of the regime because of his articles being translated into Arabic and being read and say, well, hey, we can be a bigger threat to the stability of your regime. So you might want to think again. And that's, I think, the message we need to send.
Right. And well, this is, again, it's they thought they could get away with it.
Yeah, which is insane.
But
it sounds like
it was just a really bad thing. Yeah, I mean, the last thing I would mention is, and again, I go back just to the real politics stuff. And, the mantra that I preach on a lot of these kind of things is that you got to do what you can where you can. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And in some relationships, we have more power to move people towards the moral place we want them to be. and others we just don't.
No,
And
that's a great point.
if you look at, I mean, look at World War II. Our one of our biggest allies was a guy named Joe Stalin, who was a horrible, terrible, no good person.
Yeah.
Certainly on par with Hitler, and we made the strategic decision that we've got to work with them to deal with the bigger threat.
Yeah.
So
no, that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought that up.
I mean, you could say, well, okay, we're not in a world war now, but it's there again. It's a similar.
Right. No, I totally agree. But and I would argue that a lot of people don't understand that we don't need the Saudis in the same way that we did in the 70s or even the 80s, and that they need us more than we need them, and that we actually have a lot more leverage than a lot of people might think. And again, that gets back to my argument of, when you go all in or mostly all in with one player in a region, there are a lot of reasons to dislike, say, a Henry Kissinger type of person, but that idea of sort of playing off powers against one another in a region, there's a good sort of realpolitik type of argument for doing that. And when you just say, well, these are our guys, we're going to go with them, you take away a lot of your leverage, essentially, which is why I think that the Trump move so much more toward Saudi Arabia is sort of a geopolitical mistake.
Okay.
All right. Well,
who would you move towards though?
Well, I think that the Obama move toward looking at Iran a little more and trying to bring them into the discussion, if for no other reason than kind of a counterbalance to Saudi Arabia. And I think that's what the Obama administration was trying to do with the nuclear deal and other things. And there are certainly reasons to think that might be successful long term, although it's problematic in the short term given the nature of the regime. Like you said, we don't have a lot of good options here in the region.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's move to domestic politics. The Treasury Department this week announced that the federal budget deficit for fiscal year 2018, which ended last month, rose to $779 billion. That's a nearly 17% increase too from 2017. And by far, the biggest contributor to this increase was a big decline in corporate tax revenues in the wake of the tax cuts passed in December of 2017. And just as a reminder, under that law, the top corporate tax rate went from 35 to 21%. And what we saw what Treasury is reporting is that corporate taxes or receipts have fallen around a third from the same period last year. And economists, of course, aren't surprised by this because they pretty much unanimously, whether right or left, said that these cuts are not going to come anywhere close to paying for themselves, which a lot of congressional Republicans were claiming at the time that this went through. And to me, Jay, this made me think about when you and I were coming up politically, and we both sort of mocked the Democrats as the tax and spend party, right?
We sure did.
But after this massive Republican tax cut and a budget, by the way, that just recently passed because essentially it boosted spending, it sure seems to me that modern Republicans are something even worse and more irresponsible than the tax and spend party. They're the borrow and spend party.
Oh, no.
I mean, am I wrong? Do you think I'm wrong?
Yeah, you're right and wrong in some ways.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, listen, as most Republicans, I think have had a continued disappointment, probably since the George W. Bush administration, or most conservatives, that's probably the better way to phrase it, in that the party has seemed to, if not abandon, then certainly move to the back burner fiscal responsibility issues. I mean, there were several rationales for doing it. One was, look, we just got to do this to get elected, and trying to do these things that would really make a difference budget-wise, entitlement reform and so forth. It's third rail kind of stuff. We just can't touch it. There was also the sense that I think during the Bush presidency that, look, we can be the, kinder, gentler, compassionate conservative by, creating a new Medicare benefit on prescription drugs, which was, huge. and that somehow then we'll get credit for this, and but you won't. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. Um, so I think there's been a frustration among conservatives, fiscal conservatives, and this also was evident in when Trump was running. That look, this guy is not someone who's committed to shrinking the size of government. Um, but here we are. So I guess my response on the deficit thing is one, okay, it wasn't entirely unexpected, and two, this is sort of you gotta spend money to make money. Um, and if you look at the growth estimates, which the CBO again was about a month or so revised upward, and this is the second time they've revised it upward. Um, Growth has exceeded expectations, and the economy has done better than expected in terms of job creation, in terms of wage growth. It was like 2.8% wage growth. So look, these things, and you're going to take this initial hit in the first year when you change it. But as time goes on, and as you mentioned, will it pay for itself? Well, it's certainly not going to pay for itself in the first year. Over the course of 10 years, and again, the estimates were if growth averages 3%, it does pay for itself. And look, we've had over a year of essential 4% growth. So I share the frustrations, your frustration, that we don't have enough fiscal responsibility and we're spending too much. That said, I think it's just a structural philosophical difference as you look at tax cuts as a expenditure. Whereas I look at it as this is just getting money back to the people it belongs to in the first place.
Right. Well, yeah, I would definitely take issue with that. I think that that gets to a fundamental ideological difference. As I would, not to put words in your mouth, but
Right.
my sense is that you would say is that it is my money, and therefore it should not be taken unless unless there is, I don't know, some extraordinarily good reason, but the benefit of the doubt should go to me in terms of
Yeah,
anything, right? And I would
that's a good way
argue
to put it. Yeah.
that that those who have more have a social responsibility, and so therefore that kind of it's my money. That's fundamentally a wrong-headed way of looking at it. Is that I have a response. I would look at it in terms of responsibilities, and it seems like you look at it in terms of kind of property rights.
Yeah.
I don't know,
All right.
but yeah, I don't think we disagree in the sense that we both would say that this is incredibly irresponsible, but our solutions would be very different. Now, I would more than quibble with you about the potential of these things to even come close to paying for themselves, and I think past history has demonstrated that. And another thing I would point out is that whenever these these estimates are made by the people who are pushing for this, they have incredibly optimistic best case scenario growth estimates from these things that almost never come out. They never use kind of like even the median estimates or the low
No,
end estimates.
but in this case, the growth estimates, if you're looking at the CBO and the sort of the Federal Reserve reporting, um, the folks who were sort of naysaying this and saying no, you can never achieve more than 2% growth. They've been proven wrong, and they've been I think we even said at the time of let's check back in a year where the growth numbers are, and they're pretty good. Now, are they going to stay? Is it going to stay at 4% for 10 years? No, of course not. Um,
But
but
then there's the other problem, the famous the post hoc fallacy, right? I mean, how can we say that? And it just simply assuming that this policy was what caused this growth, and I think that there's that's certainly questionable. There are a lot of other factors.
Sure. There's always other factors, but if you look at timing, if you look at this is not just post hoc fallacy tends to be something where you can't draw a definite connection between what happened and the result, the cause and the effect. In this case, the cause is essentially giving a whole lot of money back to corporations.
Right.
And again, we should note that individual tax receipts are more or less what they were before.
Right.
So the changes to the individual tax, hasn't seemed to play a big role in this. But but look, this, and you and I both talked about this, that we're in a position strategically where if you want to stay competitive in the world, the U.S. would have to address the way it did its corporate taxes. Mm-hmm. So it's also a matter of look, if this is a long-term investment in keeping countries here or keeping companies here, and getting investment to be spent in the U.S. as opposed to keeping money or investing overseas. And the last point, I think, I thought about this the other day of a good way to frame it. Democrats were very much in favor of, stimulus spending, right? In some ways, if you want to say that tax cuts are a form of spending, then what it is, it's a stimulus, but the way that stimulus money is spread around is it's up to the market as opposed to up to the government. And I think the market does a better job of allocating that stimulus money to places where it's going to make a difference than the government does.
But and just to be clear, you're not saying that you think that this was that this is sort of being fiscally responsible on the part of Republicans and that we don't have to worry about anything. You would be in favor of kind of more of a Paul Ryan-ish sort of solution, which would couple these sort of massive corporate tax cuts with equally massive reductions in government spending.
Yes.
Okay. And
yeah. Trump, I think, actually just called for all of his cabinet agencies to reduce spending by 5%.
Right. Which is one of those things that I think is a kind of across the board spending cuts is sort of a
right. And again, it's a little silly because some places need cuts more than others.
Except defense, which apparently we are committed to having. We're not big enough yet in defense, and in fact, the Congress keeps on appropriating even more than the administration asked for, which is one of those things that just drives me absolutely nuts. But that's another story. So.
Right.
So yeah, well, I guess it's fair to say that I would agree that it's oftentimes premature to judge these things after even a year or a couple of years. But I would also assume that there are circumstances under which you would be inclined to conclude that the tax cuts didn't work, right? I mean, you're not this isn't an article of faith for you, is it?
Well, in some ways, I think it is. I mean.
So evidence doesn't matter? I mean, you're just going to assume that tax cuts are always a good thing, no matter what the evidence shows?
If the question is, I'm not sure what you mean by didn't work. I guess, I look at, okay, we had sort of growth below 2%, and now we've got growth double that. We've got, more jobs than people, lowest unemployment in 50 years, wages are going up. We've had more reinvestment by companies. So much of the other on this tax stuff is because companies are able to take the immediate deductions for new purchases as opposed to amortizing them. So yes, in that frame, I think it has worked. Now, if you're going to say has it worked in reducing the deficit over the first year, no. But I think growth is the only way forward because it's much more difficult to cut these programs. And if the suggestion is that if you had a Democratic Congress, they would be more circumspect with public spending, I think you're mistaken.
I think they would be more inclined to raise taxes, and that's if it's done the right way. That's exactly what I would like to see. But I would also.
My concern, just to finish the thought, would be, and what happens then is you raise taxes and you end up killing that growth, you end up killing that employment, and you're not changing the spending picture. The spending picture will always increase. You need growth to counterbalance it.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't disagree with the importance of growth. I would say it's a matter of how the taxes are, how the tax system is set up, because you don't want a tax system, of course, that discourages growth. But I think that, and you probably recall that I actually thought that a lot that was done in terms of the corporate tax cuts was necessary. So I'm not changing my position.
I'm surprised to be hearing all of this.
No. What I'm pointing out is that so I'm not changing my position just because it's convenient at this point in time from a partisan standpoint. But what I'm saying is that we need to look at how we've structured this system. And I believe there are ways by raising individual taxes, by essentially, I think the corporate part of it, there's a lot to be said for that. But on the individual side, I think we've got some major problems, and there are too many people in that top 1%, 5% who just aren't paying anywhere close to what I would consider to be their fair share, and they need to pay more. That's how I feel about it. So, and I also feel that we need to raise taxes a lot more on financial middlemen as opposed to manufacturers and people who are creating the jobs and creating real tangible things in this economy. I think that would be a very important thing to do. So.
All right. Eat the rich.
Yeah. Well, no. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, on that note, before we move on, we want to thank our newest supporters, Adam, who was a new supporter through PayPal. He wrote in to say, "I've been enjoying your weekly show for the last year now, and I figured it was time to kick in a little. Thanks."
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, and then there's Noam, who also is a new contributor through PayPal, who writes, "Hey guys, longtime listener, second-time supporter here. I'd like to thank you for bringing more diverse voices to the show. Here's to a more nuanced and inclusive discussion." Well, thank you, Noam, and we're happy to bring in different voices to kind of give us some other perspectives, which we've been doing lately. Then there's Dave, a new Patreon supporter, who writes, "I've enjoyed listening to you guys for nearly 2 years now, and I figured it was only fair for me to help support the cause. I don't have, I thought so too. I don't much of a political background," Dave writes, "and frankly, not even much interest in politics. But the 2016 election was such an eye-opening experience for me because it showed just how segregated we become in our politics, in our news consumption, and in our worldview. Though I consider myself a conservative independent, I live in a very progressive college town. Living in this thought bubble where 90% of my neighbors and Facebook friends,
I hear you, Dave.
are to the left of me ideologically, I was literally stunned when Trump won. Rather than demonizing the people who voted for him, which I sadly see too much of, I figured what I needed most was to seek to understand the other side of the coin. So the first thing I did after the election was to get off Facebook, and the second was to look for news media where I could hear thoughtful dialogue that represented both sides of a particular issue. I was so pleased to find you guys and have been a loyal listener ever since. Though I typically fall somewhere between you and Jay, I feel bad that he gets such a hard time from listener feedback. While his pragmatic and rational response to certain issues often is what gets him in trouble, I find it to be a particularly valuable aspect of the show. We could all use a lesson in stepping back from the emotional ledge and taking a well-reasoned approach to important issues. I appreciate you continually coming to his defense and reminding folks that conservatives generally aren't heartless monsters. Generally. Keep up the good work and best of luck to all of you." I thought that was a great comment.
That was very nice,
Dave. Yeah, I think it's so much in fitting with what we try to do with the show, and that's why I wanted to read out the whole thing. Thank you so much for your support and that comment. Then there's also Nick. Nick's been a sustaining supporter of Patreon for a while. He recently doubled his monthly pledge of support, and that's just great. Thank you so much, Nick. And of course, we really appreciate the support. And when you become a supporter, not only do you get that kind of warm glow of satisfaction of supporting what we're doing, but you also get access to our special supporters only after show. Last week on the show, Trey and Alexandra talked about the Trump administration's response to the latest UN climate report, the Fed's move to raise interest rates, and this week, Jay and I got some stuff lined up for you that we think you will like as well. So if you want to support the show, just go to politicsguys.com/support, and or just go to politicsguys.com if you want to click on support, and then you'll find the Patreon or PayPal links. It really helps us out. We greatly appreciate it. All right. So moving on. This week, the Department of Health and Human Services announced a new rule that would require drug makers to include the list price for a 30-day supply of any drug covered under Medicare or Medicaid that they advertise, which really covers nearly any drug that would be advertised in the first place. Right. Now, the rule is currently in the draft status, but it's intended by the administration as the move toward greater price transparency, which they believe will make consumers more price conscious and then by extension force drug companies to lower their prices. Now, interestingly, only hours before the announcement, Pharma, which is the drug industry's lobbying group, they announced a voluntary action in which drug companies would post prices on their websites. And the administration responded to this saying, well, that's not nearly enough because there's a big difference between directing consumers to a website and having price information right there in the ad. Mm-hmm. Now, the drug company's argument is that including pricing information in ads would be confusing, misleading, and that it, quote, isn't what consumers want, though I'm not sure what their basis is for that last bit.
I'm assuming they don't want something that's confusing or misleading.
Sure, okay, fair enough. I don't know why they think that. But anyway, they also suggested that that a requirement like this could raise some First Amendment issues, and I'm guessing on the grounds that it's compelled speech. But in a number of similar instances, courts have upheld the government's authority to compel companies to provide essentially transparent pricing information. Now, to me, Jay, this is one of these instances where I occasionally and sort of oddly find myself, and that's supporting a Trump administration initiative.
I know.
But that said, I honestly don't think it's going to do a whole lot to alter consumer behavior or to lower prices. But I could be wrong about that, certainly. And I feel that it's worth trying. And other things being equal, more price transparency is a better thing. What I would hope is that the administration could get behind something I think could really move the needle on this, like, for instance, letting Medicaid negotiate prices with drug makers or allowing importation of drugs for Canada. But that's not something I see happening given, the clout of the pharmaceutical industry. So I was curious about your take on this.
Well, I mean, one, you'll see how much clout the pharmaceutical industry has.
This may not even happen. That's important to point out.
With how this plays out. My sense is actually I would tend to side with the folks at the pharmaceutical industry who have said this is sort of will be not helpful and will just tend to be confusing because what they're talking about is the list price, which almost no one pays. Everyone will pay something different based on their insurance, based on other discounts. Based on bulk discounts of where you get it, based on whether you're buying the name brand or the generic equivalent. So I think there's room for a lot of confusion, and what it's going to come out looking as is these drugs are incredibly overpriced. But when you figure no one actually does that, the more insidious part of this I think goes to looking at the profit margins that I think there was part of the rule that dealt with that and if you look at profit margins per drug, they are the drugs that succeed are extremely high, but that doesn't take into account the almost 80% that don't make it past trial. So my sense is, again, I'm just going on general conservative principles. If the pharmacies believe they can do good for consumers by advertising this and increase their sales, they will. I'm not crazy about having the government weigh in, saying more about what they have to do on commercials.
Okay.
And all that said, I think actually, pharmaceutical commercials are probably one of the greatest sources of entertainment in today's media.
Yeah. You're of course referring to, I assume, in part the half of each ad that the side effects. Yeah. Side effects may include death.
So it's one of those. Again, you have a 30-second ad, and 3 seconds are devoted to what this can do for you, and the other 27 seconds are the potential side effects, and then now we'll add in the price, and you can. I don't know if they can do the price if depending on this insurance or that insurance, or if you buy generic or all that. And I think what might happen in a lot of cases is pharmaceutical companies, should this rule go through, just say, all right, we're just not going to advertise it like that. So
yeah, well, to me, I thought an interesting way to look at this is this actually can fit into the president's kind of we're getting ripped off. The United States is getting ripped off here because you can make a really good argument that essentially high drug prices in the U.S. essentially subsidize lower prices in much of the rest of the world, and that we're being played for suckers by the pharmaceutical industry. And that seems to be kind of a very populist type of argument. And certainly the Trump administration has claimed that they're interested in reducing pharmaceutical prices, and that would fit with that. And I think that's a reasonable argument to make, because of course that's what pharmaceutical companies do, is because they're forced to charge lower prices in countries that regulate these things. Then they have to they feel they make up for it somewhere, and they can charge, sky's the limit type prices in the United States. And we've talked about this before. We have a weird healthcare system in this country compared to the rest of the world, a weird, awful healthcare system compared to the rest of the world.
Look at this. The price, though, of pharmaceuticals in terms of total medical care is really still a pretty small percentage. I'm thinking somewhere in the neighborhood of 3%. And now that's taken overall, of course. Now, if you've got something that is, there are certain drugs that are in themselves extremely expensive. So if you happen to be on one of those, you're obviously outside the average, and it doesn't, that's sort of cold comfort to you to say, well, on average, it's not so much. But I think that's with those situations, they're sort of few and far between, and probably one of the reasons is that it's either rare or serious conditions, and the what you have to go through to get the drug approved is so much, and then there's sort of a very small market for it on the other side. But that's I guess that's neither here nor there. That's just sort of
sure
the general economics of the thing. But I don't see the rule doing much than just adding a burden to pharmacy companies. I don't think it's going to help consumers, or I don't think it'll really lower prices either.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I also wanted to mention on the First Amendment issue, I think that's kind of a sort of a ridiculous argument, especially because the rule is being framed as a requirement for drugs that are covered under Medicare or Medicaid. So in other words, then it becomes not a compelled speech issue, but sort of a condition of coverage. It's like, well, if you want this covered under Medicaid, you have to do this. And that changes the nature of the issue. So, but I actually wouldn't be surprised if this never goes into effect. I mean, we'll see, but I'm skeptical.
Well, and just so everyone understands, because this is a good a learning opportunity here about the rulemaking process. And what you've got is you get a draft rule, and then it gets published, and then we're not even to the draft rule yet. And then there's what's called the public comment period. Right. People come in. It's
kind of a joke. I mean, the public doesn't really comment. It's sort of interest groups comment, and there are robo comments and that sort of thing. But there's very little public in the public comment period.
Well, in some ways, though, I mean, there's a public comment section and the industry ought to certainly be involved, right? I mean, that's.
I'm not saying that they shouldn't be allowed to comment.
So here, it's they can make the case of, look, this rule is problematic. This part of it's problematic, but if you did it this way, it could be workable. And I think that's beneficial. That part of the public comment thing, not so much the robo comments, but
yeah. All right. Well, Jay, we're running a little bit long, but before we do go, I want to get into what we're reading. Actually, this week I wanted to talk about not a thing that I'm reading, but an app that I recently downloaded. So something a little bit different. Yeah. So there's this app called Outvote, and maybe some listeners have heard of it. But basically, the idea is you download this app, and it syncs to your contacts. It finds everyone in your contacts who lives in a swing district, and then it lets you know who these people are, and it gives you a reminder to essentially send them a text or send them a reminder.
Them relentlessly.
To vote, basically. Because what political science research has found is that personalized messages from somebody are way more effective to get people to come out and vote than anything else. And so they're kind of combining that research with the social aspect with making this app. And it's interesting. Now, I should point out this app only focuses on, this is a liberal app. This is designed to help Democrats.
You don't say.
But I would say that if there is a conservative version of this, I would certainly promote that as well. But as far as I know, there isn't. So listeners, if you know of something, let me know. I just thought it was a really fascinating use of social technology and smartphones and, all the big data that we have to kind of combine all these things together. That said, and maybe this is just because I don't know, I'm older and more skeptical, but I got to say, it made me a little uncomfortable when I downloaded the app and it kind of went through my contacts and just kind of synced all that and told me this stuff. And I felt like there was a bit of a privacy issue for me. And I said, well, should I have done this? And then I started to get messages from them.
And issue for you. It's a privacy issue for all the other people whose information you just sold.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. So, I'm a little leery of these things. And that, I think, that's in part a generational thing because, you and I think came of age in an era where privacy was still sort of a thing. And it's much less.
I wouldn't say privacy was. It's not like you sat around thinking about, oh, I'm so happy, no. I'm so private. It's just you didn't. The whole notion of of people knowing all this other stuff about you just wasn't there.
Yeah, but I think there's two sides of this coin. For people who, if you really want to make an impact, something like this can really potentially leverage your contacts and your information to help you make much more of a difference than you could have otherwise. But the downside is, well, that loss of privacy. And so it's sort of I find it just a really interesting use of technology, but I'm just skeptical in general of giving away so much of my privacy. In this case, I thought, well, I'm willing to do that given sort of the stakes in the election, and I'll see kind of who's in these swing districts and that sort of thing. But I got to say, I'm still a little uneasy. But if you are left of center and you want to try this out, I'll put a link to it in there. But I certainly understand folks who are a little bit hesitant about that sort of thing.
I could do a show just on that, but
just on your concerns about privacy, or
it's only it's the gosh, if only liberals had access to Facebook to post political things.
But it's more than that. I mean,
to me, I'm just saying I think it's going to come across as like, oh my gosh, there's another crazy political post from that guy I went to college with. You know what I mean? That's sort of.
Yeah. Well, I think the difference here is it's not so much like a social media post, but it's you reaching out to your friend who lives in some really close district saying, hey, I don't know if you know, but the election's really close and this could make a difference. And so it's more of a personal thing than kind of a broadband sort of thing. And that
respond, leave me the hell alone.
Yeah,
you don't even live here.
Yeah, I'm no longer your friend because of this, certainly. But so that's a risk you got to take, I guess. So anyway, but I did want to mention that. And with that, I think we're about done. But before we do,
can I do one quick plug?
Oh, definitely, absolutely. You can do a plug.
I don't really have anything.
No, please do.
This week. No, I would say podcast. I say I never listen to podcasts, and
that's
I really don't. But have you heard of this podcast called Serial, Mike?
Serial, oh yeah.
Serial, yeah.
Familiar with it?
Yeah, you heard of these guys?
Yeah, they're a little bigger than we are, just slightly, but yeah.
Anyway, this year they are focusing on the Cuyahoga County justice system.
Oh, there you go.
So it's something that hits close to home, and it's sort of fun listening. And again, it's focused on the criminal justice aspect as opposed to the civil justice stuff. But for those who are interested in getting maybe a little taste of my world or how courts of the justice system works, it's fantastic and eye-opening, and I could tell you stories. Anyway, so I was just gonna plug that, just sort of like
sure.
a civic boosterism for my hometown, and
absolutely. All right, and before we do go, just to let everyone know that just after we're done with this show, Jay and I will be recording that bonus special supporters after show. And this week, I think we'll talk a little bit about Elizabeth Warren's DNA test, which is that was a big topic on a Facebook group this week, and also on a more kind of substantive policy related thing. There's a new rule that has gone into effect that affects student loans that the Betsy DeVos Education Department kind of first were definitely very much against, and now they're sort of reluctantly going to follow through with. And we'll talk a little bit about that. That should be interesting, I think. So we hope you enjoyed it. If you're a supporter, and if you are a supporter, it should be waiting for you by the time you hear this. That is, if I do my job right, and let's hope I do. If you're not a supporter, again, to get access to that, politicsguys.com/support, and you can just take care of that right away and get that show. All right, well, that's it. Thanks for listening. We do hope you like what you heard. And even if you're not a financial supporter, if you're, broke, destitute, whatever, it's just you and your podcast app, you could still help us out. And we would really appreciate it by subscribing to the show, by sharing episodes, by leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes or whatever app you're listening to.
Don't cost nothing.
That doesn't cost a single penny. Absolutely. Just a little bit of time. And also, we really love to hear from you. If you've got a question, comment, if you heard something today and you're like, my God, what were those guys saying? Or my mic is just insane on this.
You always encourage people like that.
I do, absolutely. I want to hear more of that. So it's mail@politicsguys.com. You can also comment on the shows on our website, politicsguys.com. There are comment sections in there, and also on our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. And again, we're also finally on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. And should finally mention, just before we leave, remember that listener survey about a host. We'd really appreciate if you could fill that out. All right, we'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.